It was a crisp Saturday morning, the kind where the air carries just enough chill to make a warm beverage feel absolutely necessary, and I had decided to treat myself by visiting the small, familiar cafe at the corner of my neighborhood, a place I had frequented for years for the quiet, comfortable atmosphere and the faintly nutty aroma of coffee beans roasting in the background. Yet I could not have predicted that my routine, mundane act of carrying my own thermos would spark an encounter that would escalate far beyond anything reasonable, highlighting how quickly entitlement and overreaction can turn an ordinary day into a confrontation involving law enforcement and public embarrassment. I entered the cafe carrying my thermos, which I had filled with my own brewed coffee at home, a habit I had developed over time because I preferred my blend to what the cafe usually offered, and because I enjoyed the subtle satisfaction of knowing exactly what went into my morning cup. It was not a statement against the cafe, nor was it meant to inconvenience anyone, simply a personal preference. The cafe was moderately busy, the usual mix of patrons scattered among the tables, some tapping away at laptops, others chatting softly, and a few quietly enjoying the morning with a newspaper or a book. And as I moved toward a corner table near the window, the smell of freshly baked pastries mingled with the robust scent of coffee, enveloping the space in that familiar, comforting aura I had always associated with leisurely mornings. I set my bag down, carefully opened my thermos, and poured a small amount into the ceramic mug I had brought along, savoring the initial steam that rose from the dark liquid. And it was in that quiet moment, when I was fully absorbed in the ritual of preparing my drink, that I first noticed a woman approaching from the back of the cafe, her posture rigid, her expression intense, and her style and demeanor instantly recognizable from countless Karen anecdotes I had seen online, the sense of self-importance practically radiating from her eyes sharp and scanning, as though she had been trained to detect breaches of social conduct wherever she went. She stopped abruptly at my table, arms folded tightly across her chest, and fixed her gaze on my thermos with a look of clear disbelief, as if she had stumbled upon a grave violation of rules that had been unspoken yet universally understood. And I sensed almost immediately that this was going to be a confrontation rather than a polite inquiry, because the intensity of her stare, the way her lips pressed together in a thin line, and the subtle but unmistakable tightening of her jaw, all conveyed that she was offended on behalf of some larger principle, rather than simply curious about my drink. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the quiet murmurs of the cafe. "Are you drinking your own coffee in here?" I looked up, startled by both the confrontational tone and the phrasing, and I nodded politely, explaining that it was my own thermos, that I enjoyed making coffee at home, and that I liked to bring it with me on occasion, always careful to use my own mug and to avoid spilling or otherwise disturbing the space or other patrons. She blinked slowly, her expression transforming from curiosity to visible annoyance, and before I could say anything further, she leveled a finger at me and said, "That's not allowed. You can't just bring outside drinks into this cafe. Someone should call the manager or even the police." Her statement caught me off guard. I had never expected someone to suggest involving law enforcement over something so trivial, and I attempted to respond calmly, hoping to de-escalate the situation, saying, "I'm happy to follow any rules the cafe has, but no one has ever mentioned a problem before, and I've always been careful not to disturb anyone." She waved her hand dismissively, clearly uninterested in any explanation or polite reasoning, muttering under her breath while pulling out her phone and rapidly typing, muttering words that sounded like illegal, violation, and must be stopped, which I quickly realized meant that she was calling 911. I couldn't believe it. The idea that someone was threatening to involve the police over a harmless thermos of coffee felt surreal, almost absurd, and yet the seriousness in her expression made it clear that this was real to her. The other patrons had begun to notice the tension, their heads lifting from laptops, newspapers, and casual conversation, some whispering to each other, others shaking their heads in disbelief. And I could feel the attention shifting to me as though I were the subject of some spontaneous trial. The ordinary act of pouring a personal beverage now elevated to an alleged threat against public order. The baristas, meanwhile, observed cautiously from behind the counter, caught between adhering to cafe policy and avoiding confrontation, their expressions a mix of curiosity and mild exasperation, as they likely anticipated that the situation could escalate if not addressed quickly. Within minutes, I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens outside, and I realized that the situation had progressed beyond words. The woman had indeed called 911. and the authorities had taken the matter seriously enough to respond immediately. Two patrol cars pulled up in front of the cafe, lights flashing briefly as officers exited and entered the establishment with practiced awareness, their eyes scanning the room to assess the scenario, while I sat quietly at my table, hands clearly visible on the mug, prepared to explain my actions with honesty and calm composure. The woman immediately approached the officers, gesturing dramatically and speaking rapidly, describing my act of bringing my own thermos as if it were some egregious violation of law or public trust, insisting that I was flouting rules, disrespecting the establishment, and creating a situation that warranted emergency intervention. Her voice rose in urgency, her expressions intense, as she painted a picture of wrongdoing that bore little resemblance to the reality of the situation. A harmless individual quietly enjoying their own coffee in a corner of the cafe. The officers listened carefully, maintaining professional composure, before turning to me and asking for my version of events. I explained calmly that I had brought my own thermos filled with my own coffee, that I had never disturbed anyone, that I had been seated quietly, and that the cafe staff had no issue with this behavior, a statement supported by subtle gestures from the baristas who nodded in confirmation. I described the woman's approach and the escalation, emphasizing my desire to remain respectful and law-abiding throughout the encounter, while refraining from any confrontation or argumentative tone. After taking notes and verifying details with the cafe staff, the officers addressed the woman, explaining that while businesses may have policies regarding outside food or beverages, her perception of illegal activity and the necessity to involve police was incorrect, and that calling 911 in such circumstances constituted an inappropriate use of emergency resources. I could see the realization slowly dawn on her as her posture slumped, her mouth opening slightly, then closing, as if she were trying to reassess the gravity of her own actions, a mix of embarrassment and indignation flickering across her face. The officers remained courteous and patient, reminding her of proper etiquette for addressing grievances in public establishments and explaining the difference between perceived offenses and actual legal violations. She muttered a few half-hearted objections before finally retreating to a table in silence, her demeanor now markedly different from the forceful, aggressive stance she had adopted upon entering. Meanwhile, I remained seated, sipping slowly from my thermos, feeling a mixture of relief, quiet satisfaction, and mild amusement at the absurdity of the situation, appreciating the fact that my calm, composed response had prevented further escalation and had allowed reason to prevail, and noticing that other patrons had resumed their routines, exchanging subtle smiles and gestures that acknowledged the bizarre, but ultimately harmless, nature of the conflict. For the remainder of the morning, the cafe returned to its usual rhythm, and I reflected on the incident, considering how entitlement, impatience, and the desire to assert control can transform ordinary behavior into perceived threats, how fragile civility in public spaces can be, and how maintaining composure, politeness, and adherence to rules is often the best strategy when confronted with someone's overreaction. I considered how easy it is for misunderstandings to escalate, and how absurd and unnecessary many conflicts are when patience and reason are absent. Realizing that this experience, though initially stressful, had offered a valuable lesson in restraint and perspective. By the time I packed up my belongings and left the cafe, the morning sun was shining fully, warming the sidewalks and reflecting off the nearby storefronts, and I walked home slowly, savoring the tranquility of the neighborhood streets, reflecting on how a simple act of bringing my own coffee had been misinterpreted as a serious violation, and appreciating the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had handled the situation with grace, honesty, and calm, leaving the overreaction behind while keeping my dignity intact. I realized that the world is full of people who view ordinary actions through the lens of personal entitlement. That escalation often arises from misunderstanding rather than malice, and that remaining composed, polite, and rational is the most effective tool for navigating absurd confrontations, even when the other party seeks to transform minor grievances into crises. In the end, the story of the morning at the cafe became a memorable reminder of how easily ordinary moments can spiral into drama, and how the right combination of patience, calm, and adherence to reason allows truth and fairness to prevail, even when confronted by someone whose sense of authority is misplaced and whose reaction far exceeds the situation at hand.